So listen, I absolutely have been that parent at the end of the day. And you know what? I'm already going to scratch that. Not even at the end of the day. It can be in the middle, even at the beginning of the day. If there is a behavior that is reoccurring, a behavior that I have already thrown the kitchen sink at, and it still keeps happening, I am not even going to kid you. I have been like, okay, I've had enough. That's it. The iPad is gone. Treats, poof. I've been there, but I'm here to tell you it doesn't work. And you already know that. It doesn't work. And sometimes it even makes things worse. So now, before we take a deep dive, let me lead with the caveat that we want to raise respectful, responsible learners. And ideally, we want that to be in a positive and not punitive way, right? And that's why we focus so much on that positive reinforcement, and we attempt to motivate our learners. We want to encourage behaviors that we want to see more of. But the truth is, positive reinforcement works, okay? We all know that. It builds confidence, it strengthens relationships, and it gives learners a roadmap for how to succeed, right? But let's be real, okay? What happens when a behavior keeps happening again and again and again, even though we have praised the good moments and we have reminded, we've put those cues in there, and we've attempted to encourage the behavior that what happens when that shit isn't working? That's when we do a shift in our gears, because if there is zero consequences for repeated behaviors that are disruptive and harmful, our learners don't learn accountability. And that's when they start to test limits, right? Even though sometimes it's subconsciously. Now that we're all on the same page, if I led with taking away that iPad is not functional and not as effective, what do? That's when I started taking away privileges. Privileges are those daily freedoms that our learners perceive as rights, but are truly luxuries. Let me give you a couple of examples. For example, my learners will go into the fridge and they have access to multiple different types of juice boxes or 3 different varieties of Gatorade. They've got access to treats in the pantry after dinner, or if they need that crunchy little snack. Some of my learners even have Alexa in their room. An important note, when I say privileges, these are the things that I'm talking about. I am talking about luxuries. I am not talking about the basic needs like sleep, meals, and safety. Next step. Now that we understand what a privilege is, it is those luxuries, not necessarily those basic needs. We need to understand which privilege we're removing. The privilege that is best removed for a behavior is when it's logically tied to the behavior and it's proportional, okay? And it's paired with opportunities to learn better options. This way, our learners are able to understand that freedom and responsibilities go hand in hand. And frankly, it teaches boundaries in a more clear and sensible way because it mirrors how the real world works. If I had expectations at work and I didn't meet them, I might lose a project or a bonus. I'm not going to lose my iPhone. I'm not going to lose my phone. Okay, now let's talk about those details. When is it appropriate to remove a privilege? It's appropriate when the behavior appears to be in the child's control. For example, when the child throws a juice box because it just isn't the right flavor. Additionally, we want to remove a privilege when the behavior is repeated and the current consequence just doesn't seem to be making that change in the behavior, or it clearly violates an established boundary. For example, if your child just happens to keep taking an item from his sister's room after they have asked him to stop. That is a boundary, it is broken, and it is repeated, all right? Next would be another one would be if you've already used positive reinforcement and reminders and there just doesn't seem to be too much of a change. Before removing that privilege, you want to make sure that you're praising, you're redirecting, you have clear reminders. And if those things don't seem to work, then removing a privilege is going to be your next step. Now that we know when we should remove privileges, it's important when to know not to remove privileges. Okay, you don't want to remove a privilege when the behavior appears to be the result of some sort of emotional regulation. If the learner is overwhelmed with some sort of sensory input, probably not the best time. You also don't want to do it if you haven't, in fact, made those expectations clear. If you haven't done any reminders, if you haven't done positive reinforcement, we don't want to remove privileges. And finally, you do not want to do it if you are too angry. At that point, the consequence is likely going to be unrelated, and it's probably going to be too excessive to the actual infraction. Okay, great. Now, there we are. Now that we have the do's and don'ts, or when and when not to, let's talk about what type of privileges you're going to be removing. Again, do not remove basic needs, right? We're going to adjust them. Such things, they are low stake consequences, okay, in order to improve behavior. For example, choices of juice boxes or drinks. They can have access to milk and water, just not juice box or Gatorade options, or drink options that don't have to be on the chopping blocks. Okay, next would be non-essential toys like action figures, dolls, games. Temporarily removing access to toys or restricting play times within specific times can be effective. Another example would be, I know for my family, regular desserts. Okay, skipping treats can be a very clear consequence. Additionally, can be postponing activities, not necessarily canceling them, but postponing them, making them shorter. And not my favorite privilege to remove, but an option, room privileges. Alexa in your room, decorative pillows, bedtime flexibility, being able to stay up later on the weekend. Yeet! You don't get to do that shit anymore. Now let's summarize some of these details. First and foremost, okay, you always want to pair it with positive reinforcement. You always want to offer ways to earn that privilege back, okay? You can have access to a particular item if you engage in an alternative behavior to the misbehavior. Not some fucking random behavior, okay? And not some behavior at the time. It needs to be an alternative behavior to the misbehavior. Numero dos, you need to be consistent. You need to apply consequences predictably and reinforce learning. Otherwise, your learner is not going to be able to catch on to, if I do X, Y happens. We want to clearly explain why the privilege is removed. This is not a fucking guessing game. Your learner needs to understand it. This is about communication. We also want to monitor the impact, ensure that the consequence motivates a change without causing some sort of excessive distress to our learners. You want to avoid removing privileges for far too long. That also cause that excessive distress. This can reduce motivation, and it just might escalate defiance, which is clearly not our goal. And finally, we want to avoid it being unrelated to the behavior. It needs to be logically connected to the misbehavior. And when I say logically connected, it needs to be logically connected for the learner. Creating space for growth and reflection for our learners. We don't want them to learn through fear. We want them to learn through accountability. You're managing their behaviors in order to build those skills.